Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Sian Ann Bessey, author of the novel A Kingdom to Claim. Sian, welcome.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be with you.
Well, I would like to start with a little bit of context. I am American. I don't know the geography of the UK all that well. So, can you start with this book you've written is about Wessex? Can you tell us first the geography and then also then go on to kind of the political context of that time and place when your novel takes place?
Yes. So the current geography of the UK, on the large island, you have Scotland at the top, and then Wales is on the western side, and then England takes up most of the rest. Um, my book is set in the 800s, so a very long time ago. And during this time, Wessex was the southern portion of what we now call England. So it would be going down towards Cornwall and over towards East Anglia, but not quite that far up. Above it were Mercia and Northumbria, and these were areas that had been created by the different peoples that had come into that country, including the Anglos, the Saxons, and it was a very it was a very mobile. um, those areas changed a lot as the wars between the people changed the boundaries, basically. And at this time, the Vikings were making big inroads into what we now call the UK. And so a great deal of that area was actually ruled by Danelaw, by the Norsemen who had come in. And so my book takes place at the time when the Vikings were trying to add Wessex to their conquests.
Tell me about the characters you use to tell us about this history, to share it with your readers. Your protagonist is Aisley. Who is she, and what are the circumstances of her life?
Aisley is the daughter of an alderman, and an alderman at the time, it would be a noble. That's kind of what we would think of it at the moment. In fact, alderman is the root of the word earl for the nobility that came later on. And she has had a fairly comfortable upbringing for that era. Um, but during at the beginning of the book, her father is killed in one of the battles with the Vikings, and at that point, her life changes. Her mother is a healer and has taught her the healing arts with regard to what plants to use for different ailments, and she has a natural aptitude for this. She's also very loyal, and when the political climate changes, she has to make some very difficult decisions. The other main character is Brecc, and he is also an alderman. He's one of the king's thanes, and he is one of the king's most loyal warriors. And so he participates in the battles and is also one of the king's confidants. And their lives intersect, and they end up needing each other in order to move forward.
And I'm curious, as you talk about battles, how much of these circumstances that you're writing about are actual historical events, and then how much did you fictionalize for the purpose of the story here between Aisley and Brecc?
Um, the historical details are as close to accurate as I can make them. When you're setting a book in the 800s, um, it's very difficult to get extremely accurate details. In fact, even the date of King Alfred's birth is a little bit up for question, just because they didn't write, that they didn't keep the kinds of records that we're used to now. Um, but but the battles that are in the book are based on real events, and one of the biggest challenges in writing historical fiction is taking an actual timeline and then weaving fictional characters and their storyline into that historical timeline without warping it too badly. And so that's something that I try really hard to do. At the end of the book, I have an author's note where I try to separate the fact from the fiction so that readers can tell, what to believe and what is made up. But for the most part, I have tried really hard to stick with what history believe really happened.
Well, with all the challenges presented from writing in the history from the ninth century, what is it about that time and place that inspired you to take the time to learn all about it and to write about it?
Well, I think I think maybe three things. The first is I grew up in Wales. I grew up on Anglesey, which is an island off the north coast of Wales, and it's probably the part of Britain, or maybe even the part of Europe, that has the most medieval castles. There were at least a dozen medieval castles within that many miles of where I grew up. And so I have always been fascinated by that time period. Um, the other thing is that as a child growing up and going through the British school system, we studied British history. And I remember the only thing I knew about King Alfred was that he burnt some cakes. And that is such a strange thing. It's such an anecdotal story, and yet it stuck with me. And I just remember thinking, there has to be more to this king than the fact that he burnt cakes. It was such a strange thing. And so I just decided I wanted to know more about him. I wanted to find out why he had burnt cakes and what that story was all about. And that curiosity led me to uncovering just information about a truly remarkable man. And I think that the third thing is I have always loved finding something from history that not many people know about and helping them to learn more about it in a fictional way because um, I know there are many people out there who love history and love research, but most of us enjoy learning in a easier, more palatable way, and fiction is a perfect vehicle for that.
Can you tell us a little more about King Alfred? I've never heard of him until I came across your novel. Was he able to fend off the Vikings?
Well, I don't want to give away the whole book story, but King Alfred was the youngest son of King Ethelwulf. And as the youngest son, I genuinely don't think he ever really thought that he would reign. Three of his brothers reigned before he did. He was significantly younger than most of them. Um, and as a child, his father took him on a pilgrimage to Rome. And so he became a very devout Christian. And I think that that guided a lot of his life afterwards. He came to the throne young. He was only about 21. His brother, who had preceded him, died from a wound that was inflicted in a battle with the Vikings. Um, and at that time, he was very inexperienced. He was young. He didn't have a lot of knowledge of how to run the kingdom. And so he did make a lot of mistakes. And at that time, the Vikings um, made inroads. And in order to try and save his kingdom, he made a deal with the Vikings and offered them something called Dengold, which is he basically paid them off. He said, I will give you this much money if you will retreat from our borders. And it lasted for a few years, but then the Vikings were greedy again and decided they really did want to add Wessex to their conquests. But that time period had given Alfred a little bit more experience, and he had surrounded himself with some good advisors. and um, the Vikings did attack. He was not expecting it because he assumed that the Dengold would keep them away. And so he had to go into hiding. And he and his closest advisors went into hiding on a little, they called it an island, but it was a piece of land surrounded by water that was kind of marshland in Somerset. And he was there for some time, um, but during that time, they started to build up a resistance. And then when the time came to fight the Vikings, he had the strength that he needed to do it. The story of burning the cakes actually comes from his escape to this little island called Athelney, and he was so consumed with he was going to lose his kingdom. How could he protect his people? And during this escape, he stopped at a cottage, and the woman there did not know who he was, and she put him in charge of her cakes, which at the time were more like we would consider them more like a bread roll. It wasn't like a sweet cake. So she put him in charge of them and went out to do something else. And he was so consumed with his own thoughts that he let them burn. And then she was furious with him. But the interesting thing is that some historians look at that as a really good reflection on his humility because he took a scolding from a peasant woman and it made it into the history books.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm the only British school child out there who can only remember that, but that was what stuck with me.
Oh, it's quite a story surrounding all that, so good for you for looking into it. Well, that's a lot of the history there you shared with us, but of course you talked about making history more palatable, fictionalizing things. So can you tell us a little bit more about the story between Aisley and Brecc? And I'm also curious to know about inserting elements of romance and the craft of that. You've done so much research, but then you have to take it a step further with these craft elements of fiction. So, can you talk about how you blend those into the story?
I can try. Um, so when I look at a piece of history that I would like to share with others, um, generally in my books, I don't fictionalize the main character. So, for example, in this book, the main characters are fictional, but they interact with people from history. So, as I mentioned before, Brecc is one of King Alfred's most trusted men. Aisley's brother, um, becomes the alderman of Wiltshire after her father dies. And in history, the alderman of Wiltshire ended up um, I don't know if I'd go as far as betraying, but he was pretty close to betraying King Alfred. And so I knew looking at the real people, I had some people that I could put in the bad guy camp, and I had some people that I could put in the good guy camp. And so creating people who were um, closely connected to those enabled me to bring in some tension. And then if those two people, if you have a man and a woman who are coming from different camps and then fall in love, then you've got another barrier, something else that they have to overcome. So there are several layers to this of things that the hero and heroine have to overcome. They have to overcome physical separation. They have to overcome coming from um, the king's camp and a traitor's camp, and then their own likes and dislikes and their own personal struggles. I was able to give them a few things that they bonded over. They both lost their fathers at a young age, and that drew them together initially. And because Aisley is a healer, she was able to help Breck and a friend of Breck's. and that brought them together. And then because he had the ear of the king, he was able to help her to share information with the king that otherwise she would not have had access to the royalty. So finding ways that the couples can come together and finding ways that push them apart help that romantic journey.
Sure. Well, I have another question related to craft, and that's about recreating 878 in a way that feels authentic, but obviously you're not writing in the actual language of the time, and there's a
Right.
lot, like you said, we don't actually know. So how do you balance that for modern readers, keeping them engaged without being so authentic that it's unreadable?
Oh, that is such a good question because that is actually one of the very hardest things, I think. Because if I was to write this the way those people actually spoke, no modern reader could understand it. It would be like Beowulf, you'd need a translation. But at the same time, you want to give enough um, of a feel of old world England that you put your readers there. So usually what I do is during my research, I will look up words that were used all the time. I've mentioned some of them already, like elderman. That's a term we're not familiar with, but it was one that they used then, and it was a title. And so at the beginning of my historical books that are set this far back, I will have a glossary of words that I have used that that people can then see what they mean. But as far as the dialogue goes, I try to make the English a little bit older sounding. Um, the phrasing changes a little bit. You tend to use had instead of apostrophe D. You use the full words, and then instead of maybe you'd put mayhap. And so you throw a few words in that are easy to understand, but transport you to an earlier time. Um, one of the big struggles that I have with that is I do write in different time periods, and immediately after writing Kingdom to Claim, I actually wrote a contemporary book, and I co-authored it with Tracy Hunter Abramson, and I actually messaged her and I said, it's going to take me about 2 weeks to get rid of the Old English. So if one pops up in this manuscript, you have to tell me and we'll switch it out. Because you do start thinking that way. You start using those words in your head, and that's how the dialogue flows. But it is tricky.
Well, let's talk more about switching genres, switching time periods. You're quite a prolific writer. I guess my first question is how did you get here? And I know you could probably talk a long time about that, but where did your author journey start, and what are some of the major points along the way?
Um, I think my author journey started when I was in college. Um, I I started writing for a magazine. I wrote short stories for a magazine, and my father, for years and years and years, said, "You should write a book. You should write a book." And every time I'd say, "It's too big. It's too long. I can't do that." But finally, when my youngest daughter was a baby, I started to feel a little sad. I now live in the US, and I started to feel a little sad that my children were growing up without the same connection to their Welsh heritage that I had had growing up in Wales. And so I started writing a fictional story that was set in a Welsh village. And I did it really as a way of sharing that heritage with them. Um, and then I sent it to my father and I said, okay, here's the book you've always asked me to write. Don't bother me again. And my sister-in-law picked up the manuscript. This was so long ago that I had actually printed it out. And she called me and she said, you should send this in to somebody. And I did. And that was the beginning of publication because they accepted it and then asked me to continue writing for them. And over the years, my writing has obviously developed and I think strengthened. I'm a stronger writer now than I was then, and so I believe my more recent books are probably a lot stronger than my earlier ones. But and the genres have changed. I've been able to write in multiple genres, um, and that's something that I really love because I feel like it keeps my writing fresh. Because I have to keep switching, I don't feel like I get in a rut. But it is an extra challenge.
So how many books have you written? I had a hard time counting them all.
Um, well, I guess it's two different questions. How many books have I written and how many books have I published? I have probably written close to 35, and I think a little more than 30 are published. I've got a few in the pipeline. So,
And what is your schedule like? Do you have a hard time saying discipline? Do you have to write out a schedule for yourself? Do you write mornings, evenings? What is that like for you?
um, I don't have a set schedule. Um a lot of my day is consumed with my writing. If I'm not actually writing, I'm editing or I'm working on something to do with marketing or something to do with my work. But I tend to get up in the morning and get my home squared away, do the dishes and those kinds of things, and then when I feel like I'm in a good place, I sit down and start working, and if I'm up against a deadline, I will work into the evening. If I don't have, something pressing, I usually try to write about 2,000 words a day. That's the goal. When I'm at the beginning of a book, it's less because I'm a discovery writer, and so it takes me a little while to get in the groove. So I give myself some grace at the beginning, knowing that it will be slower, and then towards the end, it tends to pick up.
Well, we're talking now on my podcast, but you also have a podcast, Between the Lines. Tell me
Mhm.
about how that came about and what it is.
Between the Lines is a podcast that I co-host with three other writers, Sarah M. Eden, Tracy Hunter Abramson, and Esther Hatch. And we we all write for the same publishing company and became friends. And the our marketing manager at our publishing house approached us and said, "How would you feel about doing a podcast?" And at first we thought she was crazy, but we were willing to give it a try, and it has just been so much fun. Our goal when we began was to have a podcast that felt as though we were sitting around a kitchen table talking with friends, and we were inviting our readers to join us. And I think that that has been successful in the sense that when we have book signings, we have readers come up to us all the time and say, "We feel like we know you. We feel like we're your friends because of this podcast." We talk a lot about the writing process, about the challenges, about the joys, about some of the ins and outs of being a writer. We also share things from our own lives and our families. Um, so it's a mixture of um, professional things and friendship things.
That's wonderful. I did want to ask you about what you just mentioned was some of the joys and challenges. What would you say is one of the most rewarding things of your work, and what is one of the most challenging things?
Um, I think one of the most rewarding things is when a reader tells me that my book has really helped them. There have been a few times when I've received emails, but most particularly if I've been at a book signing and someone has come through and has said something like, "I was at the hospital, my mother was dying, and your book was the only thing that kept me going." When I feel like I have lifted or made a positive difference in somebody's life, that's when I feel like I've done something worthwhile. And touching readers like that has been a big blessing in my life. Um, Challenging? Oh, that list is probably a little bit long, but um, I think one of the most challenging things is um, juggling all that I need to do, wanting to do my very best work, and yet knowing that I have limited time and there's so much to writing a book that I didn't realize that's not writing, it's like I said, the book signings, it's the marketing, it's the promotion, it's the editing, it's the proofing, all of these things. And sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is finding balance, um, is 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 saying, yes, this is my writing time, but now I need to have family time, or not feeling so overwhelmed that other things fall through the cracks.
Well, Sean, I just want to congratulate you on your latest release, Kingdom to Claim, and it's been such a pleasure talking to you, hearing about your craft and about your work. I'm just really excited for all that you've achieved, and I'm sure readers definitely will look forward to this release and your releases coming forward.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be with you, and I just appreciate the invitation to spend time on your podcast.